Okay, what I want to talk about right now is, welfare issues, handling, transport, and slaughter. That's something I've worked on for years. And I also want to talk about finding practical ways to make things better. How can we actually fix things out in the field with solutions that are really going to work? Now, what are some of the main issues in handling? People are not trained and supervised. That can be a really big issue. Or you can have a facility problem, or you can have an animal that's very, very difficult to handle. When you're trying to problem solve, you've got to figure out if I got a people problem, a facility problem, or is there something that with this animal that makes it extremely difficult to handle, like it's really old and it's lame, or maybe it's been fed too many beta-agonist feed additives, and it's weak from that because it's had this huge muscle growth. You got to figure out what is causing a problem. Let's say you're working with a behavior problem with a pet. You got to figure out, is it fear motivated? Is it separation anxiety motivated or aggression motivated? That's going to affect how you're going to deal with the problem. Calm animals are easier to handle, and that applies to dogs and cats too. The animal gets all upset, scared, and fearful. It's going to take 20 minutes for it to calm back down. So the trick is don't let it get all excited in the first place. With animals such as cattle, they need to understand the basic behavior principles. Another thing I want to emphasize is an electric prod should never be somebody's primary driving tool. I'm adamant about get it out of your hands. And then, unfortunately, there are a few people that probably shouldn't be handling animals. They like to hurt them, and they just shouldn't be handling them. I have found in working with people on handling animals, there's about 20% that are sort of the natural-born animal handlers. Boy, they just really know how to do it. And most other people can learn behavior principles and learn it. I sometimes have said to some of my livestock clients that I'd rather just take some people out of the office staff and train them from scratch than have people that have a whole lot of bad habits that I'm trying to break. This is the flight zone principle. Now, if you have an animal that's trained to lead, you're not going to have any flight zone. Okay, you lead the horse, you lead the show steer. But you have animals that have got some flight zone. They're going to move away from you. You want to work on the edge of the flight zone. If it's jumping up and down and shooting, going berserk, back off. Give it some space. You've got a blind spot right behind the rear end. You stand in that blind spot, and you're likely to get, kicked. Also, you got this point of balance right here. You got to be behind it to make it go forward, and in front of it to make it go backwards. Seems like a really basic thing, but I don't know how many times I see somebody stand at the head of the animal poking its butt. And we're telling them to go forward and back at the same time. And here's just a really handy way to get the animal to go into the squeeze chute. You walk back by them. When you quickly walk back by them, they'll go forward. Now, of course, on completely tame animals, this doesn't work. But these are just an example of using behavioral principles to get your animal to do things. I want to get you to use behavior to control animals, not force. That's the key. I'll tell you another little tip about handling pets. A non-slip floor. Let's get a mat on that table so that pet's not slipping around. Because if that animal starts to jig like this, it panics. A horse will panic, cattle will panic, any cats and dogs panic. Non-slip floor. Another principle is sudden jerky motion that scares. Also, you got to hold it. It's steady pressure. Support the body. You pick it up, support the body. Fear of falling is a primal fear. There's also sort of an optimal pressure for holding an animal. Doesn't matter whether it's a kitten that you're holding or you're holding a cow in a hydraulic squeeze chute. The mistake people make is squish it too tight. You got to hold it just tight enough so it feels held. And I'm very, very pleased that one of the students in our veterinary college came back and told me that they called him the kitty whisperer because he could handle all the scared, upset cats. I'm just demonstrating there, turning an animal with a little stick with a flag on it. Now, when the cattle are all excited and stuck together, this isn't going to work very well. But when they're calm, I can just manipulate them with this. Another thing I've learned on handling is you've got to get management to buy into good stockmanship. Management's got to get behind it. Because when I first started my career, and I've now been around for 35 years, first 10 years of my career, I spent a lot of time training the employees, and management untrained them for me. So then I got to the point where I want to train the managers, because I got to get management behind having good stockmanship. And there's a lot of benefits in good stockmanship, aside from being the right thing to do. Animals that get scared and excited gain less weight. Pigs that are afraid of people have less piglets. Cows that are afraid of people give less milk. So there's lots of good reasons for having good stockmanship. And when you take the electric prodders out of people's hands, people get really creative on coming up with some, creative driving tools. Should electric prods be banned? There's some people who say, well, just ban them. Well, my answer is no. What I'm going to say is never constantly carry it in your hand. You only use it on the animal that absolutely won't get in the squeeze chute, or it absolutely won't go in the stun box. Because the electric prod's better than cranking its tail off, beating it up. I've seen too many people beat animals. But I'm adamant about getting it out of your hand. And if you do a really good job with your facilities, fixing facilities and handling, you can get it down to where you can get 99% of the animals through without having to, ever use it. But I wouldn't ban it. I've seen too many abusive things. I remember a ranch years ago, this guy goes, I never used an electric prod, and he picks up a shovel. I've seen a shovel taken, beaten with a shovel, and I've also seen him take the handle of a tool and then ram it into the side of a cow as hard as he could. He says, we don't ever use any hot shots. Well, I don't think that's real good. Another important thing is, let's make an animal's first experience with something new a good first experience. Let's make puppy's first experience with a veterinarian a good first experience. So they won't be afraid of the vet. The first experience is slip-sliding around. That's not going to be a good first experience. Let's make the first experience stand on a mat and you get a treat and you get put on that table. You're a lot better. There's some basic principles in handling animals that you got to teach. Like with cattle and pigs, you fill your crowd pen half full. This is one of my round crowd pen systems. You might wonder why design it this way. Because as the cattle come on around the bend, they think they're going back to where they came from. On using behavior. Basic principle I want to get across is to use behavior to get animals to do stuff rather than force. And some of this takes sort of a difference in your mindset on how you work with those animals. Okay, let's say I got a problem where I've got too much use of the electric prodder. The first thing I got to do is train people in basic principles of cattle handling and pig handling. And once I got them trained, then I got to look at, well, how many animals are balking? Because if I got animals backing up and balking, there's no way I can have good handling. They don't want to go up the chute. I've got to remove the things the animals are afraid of in the chute, like reflections, chains hanging down. If they can see people up ahead, maybe put up some plywood to block their vision. And I got to have non-slip flooring on livestock scales, on single-file alleys, stun boxes, all those kind of places like that. I got to have a non-slip floor, just essential. Now, here are some of the things you want to look for. They see that bright green hose, and domestic animals can see yellow and blue really well. So dogs, cattle, all those animals. Birds can see full color. Primates see full color. But animals are very, very sensitive to contrast, a high contrast of light and dark. Now, you see on this slide right here, we got a little chain hanging down in the chute. I've been talking about little chains hanging down in chutes for 35 years. Why do I still have to keep talking about it? Because people don't remove them. And one of the things that's helped me as an autistic person working with animals is I think visually. I see little details. Animals are into details. A lot of people tend to not notice these details. The animal doesn't want to go up the chute, so we just prod it more. No, take out the things that he's afraid of. A calm animal, he'll look right at that stuff he's afraid of. He'll show you where it is. But if you just force him up there, he's going to turn back, and he's going to just get all scared. Here's just an example where I put some cardboard up so that as the animal comes into the squeeze chute, they don't see you standing there next to the squeeze chute. Real simple things. I do a lot of work with the meat plants. And the first thing I do is I do what I call lights and cardboard. I get portable lights on a cord, and I try putting them in different places because the animals don't like dark places. I cover things up with cardboard so they don't see stuff that moves. I move lights so they don't see reflections like on the wet floor. Sometimes you can just move a light a little bit, and the reflection goes away. And in Animals in Translation and Humane Livestock Handling, which I'm really happy to see that you've got here, I have checklists of distractions. There's checklists of distractions in those books, the things that you need to find and remove. Now look at how that animal is looking right at that bright sunspot on the ground there. That's contrast. They'll tend to see that. Now one really nice thing here is they got a woven mat made out of old tires that gives really great non-slip footing coming out of that chute. And there's a light being used to light up the chute. They don't like dark places. But that light must not shine in the animal's eyes. You see how it's pointed? to light the way in front of the animal. Now, another thing I've done a lot of work on is measuring handling, because one of my biggest problems is I'd get handling good, and then people would slowly slip back into old rough handling methods. You got to measure handling. Here I made an improvement, putting a light on the entrance of a chute, and with well-trained handlers, I went from 38% of the pigs getting poked with this electric prod down to 4%. But then you also need to have a program in there, and I do a lot of work with the meat plants, where every day we go out and we score how many fell down, how many pigs were squealing, how many had the prod put on. Because if you don't measure things, you have a tendency for it to get worse again. Can you imagine what the highways would be like if the police never ever measured speeding and, pulled you over for speeding? Everybody would be going like so fast on the highway, it would be really, really dangerous. Now, things like handling you need to measure too. Now, these are some of the things that can cause cattle to be hard to handle. They can be lame. And let's look at some animal welfare issues. You know what I think is one of the biggest animal welfare issues in a lot of animals, and not just farm animals? Well, lameness. Look at some of these dogs. They've got all these hip problems. Why are we breeding dogs with all these skeletal abnormalities that make them lame? Lameness is a gigantic animal welfare issue. We get it in farm animals because we're pushing the biology too hard. Gain. We can push them with genetics. We can push them with, too many feed additives and hormones, things like that. You end up with an animal that's weak. And some of these dogs have a lot of problems. Or we just select some stupid appearance trait like smashed-in bulldog faces. Get that more and more smashed in, they can't breathe and they can't birth normally. Another big problem area in farm animals are the old cull animals, like old chickens, old dairy cows. The dairy cows need to be marketed before they're emaciated bone racks. Unfortunately, the laying hen has been bred to be such a producer, she's not worth sending to the processing plant to make soup out of anymore. So they just take them to rendering and throw them away. I was just up at a chicken conference, and I have to say the handling of spent hens is horrendous. It's an area where there needs to be a lot of improvement. Now you can have animals that are really wild and excitable. Some of that's genetics, some of that's rough handling, some of it's not having enough contact with people. You feed them too much beta agonists. These are products that make them put on a lot of muscle, but it can cause lameness if you do it in excessive amounts of it, and it can cause weakness, where your animal's weak. And another problem is the animal's a visual thinker. So a man on a horse and a man on the ground that's viewed by cattle as two separate things. And if they've only been handled by people on horseback, they can be dangerous to handle by people on foot. Or if you have a horse that's got a behavior problem, and you might have a problem with him when you ride him, but he's good for veterinary work on the ground. Or you can have a problem with veterinary work on the ground, and shoeing is terrible, and he's fine for riding because he had some past experience, and you think it's a picture. It's remembered as a picture or a sound, so it's specific. Man on the ground, man on the back, that's two different things. Constant kicking, that's cattle that have had dogs on them, where they're in a confined area where they're not able to get away from the dogs. Well, here's an example of horrible leg conformation in a pig. Unfortunately, some of the pig breeders just got breed for gain, and they forgot about feet and legs. Well, now they're starting to do some selection for good feet and legs. There's a big difference between easy to drive and hard to drive pigs on how much you use the electric prod on them and how much they squeal. And I can measure that. See, one of the things we got to make sure that we avoid, both in agriculture and with some of the problems we're getting now with selection for appearance traits in pets, is bad becoming normal. Okay, a younger generation now coming into working with bulldogs might think it's normal for them to have all these breathing problems and to have all these problems they're having their babies. Well, if you go back and you look at old pictures of bulldogs used for sports teams like in the 30s and 40s, they looked a whole lot different. But the thing is, they slowly got worse. Or you take the dairy cows. When I started with dairy cows in the 70s, lameness was 5%. Now it's up to 24%. But what happened is it slowly got worse. And since it slowly got worse, you sort of get like the new normal. Well, 25% lame, that's just absolutely horrible. Now, Now, one of the ways to reduce some of these problems, animals that have problems, is some of the slaughter plants charge a handling fee for downer animals. Nothing like a $25 handling fee to get producers to be more careful on how many beta agonists they feed the pigs, or other problems. If producers have to pay for bruises, you get less bruises. It gets into some financial accountability. I've also done a lot of work with McDonald's, Wendy's, and other restaurant companies on implementing auditing programs for the meatpacking plants. And when a big customer says they got to do this, boy, it really makes a difference. The plant risks losing $1 million worth of business. It makes them do things. It gets back to economic incentives. This brings up another thing. Animal welfare to a lot of big corporations used to just be an abstraction. Okay, McDonald's or Wendy's, okay, there's a protest outside one of their restaurants, okay, legal department can handle that, PR department can handle that. I took some of these executives on their first trips to farms and slaughterhouses. And when things went well, they were really happy. And when things went badly, they realized, oh, whoa, there's some things here that need to be fixed. Like the day a half-dead dairy cow walked up the ramp into their product. Boy, they just about lost it. But those executives needed to get out of that office and experience on the ground what was actually happening. And truth somewhere in the middle. Things are not the horror show that some of the animal groups say it is, but on the other hand, it's not a rose garden like what some of the agriculture people say it is. And lots of times when a slaughter plant was working well, they go, oh, it's not so bad. But when there was something really bad, like the day we went to a pig farm, and there was a pig dying in the alley with no feed and no water, and they walked our tour group over it like it was an empty feed sack. And our tour group from one of the restaurant companies had a very bad impression of that. That's simple. How about hard-to-handle pigs? It's important that producers walk through the pens of pigs, because the animal differentiates. A man in the pen or a person in the pen, person outside the pen. It's two different things. You've got to get them used to having people walking through them. Pigs have a lot of problems with lameness. When the industry went to the lean line pigs, we also got a more excitable, meaner pig. Fights worse, and more excitable, higher startle response. Now, nobody deliberately is going to select for mean pigs. Nobody's deliberately going to do that. It was a side effect of selecting for leanness. And why did I notice it? Because I'd go to these plants, they slaughter all kinds of different pigs all over the place. And I could see the differences, different pens of pigs from different producers in terms of startle response when you shook the gate. I mean, it was just amazing. Now, these beta agonists, this is something I'm really worried about. I've seen lame cattle, heat-stressed cattle, very weak pigs that can't walk from one end of the plant to the other. I've got real problems with that. One of my biggest animal welfare concerns is overloading that biological system. We've done it to dogs, too. My students manage to always buy dogs or rescue dogs that I definitely don't recommend. And my student rescued a Shar-Pei. It's been nothing but skin problems, cortisone baths, all kinds of things. And she's finally got it straightened out. But he's so wrinkly that when he stands, it hangs down around below his knees. The skin hangs down. I don't think the original Shar-Pei was that wrinkly. I mean, there's a point where you're making a deformed freakazoid out of the dog. I saw a Shar-Pei on one of the students' screensavers in our department. I didn't think this was cute. They thought it was cute. I wouldn't have this picture around anywhere, so I thought it was revolting. The wrinkles were so bad that they folded out over the dog's nose. And I'm going, that's not cute. It wouldn't be on my computer. It wouldn't be on anything. It had anything to do with me, because that's like putting a deformed freak up there. That's not cute. And that dog has all kinds of medical problems because of that. You've overloaded that biological system. You select for a single trait. It can be an appearance trait or a production trait, and you're going to wreck your animal and cause all kinds of problems for it. And this is something I'm very, very concerned about. We need to be breeding animals that are of sound body and of sound mind. I've recently just got back from the 5-week book tour on my book on Animals Make Us Human, and I talked about the core emotional systems in animals: fear, rage, separation anxiety, and seeking. There's an awful lot of dogs today that are spending an awful lot of time home alone, and some animals handle that a whole lot better than other animals. But some animals have a really bad time when they're left home alone, and they're licking their paw and chewing it up. They're chewing up the house, chewing a whole bunch of stuff up, and That's not a very good, quality of life. I'm concerned about that. Okay, how do we maintain good animal handling practices? It requires constant measurement. It requires a management commitment to constantly measuring it. Management's got to get behind, got to really believe that having good practices is really important. Because if you don't get management behind it, it's not going to happen. It's just that simple. Okay, now here are things that I can measure in handling. How many animals did you poke with the electric prod? How many animals fell down? How many animals were moving way too fast? I want them walking and trotting. How many animals were vocalizing? Vocalizing right during handling. You poke it with a prod, it's going to move, it's going to squeal. It hits a gate or something, it's going to, it's going to vocalize. You hold him too tight in a restraining device, he's going to vocalize. You can measure, vocalization is the outcome of a lot of, bad things. See, one of the things that's being done now, animal welfare auditing, is we're going to be measuring outcomes. Okay, if a cow gets too skinny, well, maybe you didn't feed her enough, or you waited too long before you marketed her, or if the animal gets lame. There's a lot of different things that can make an animal lame. It's an outcome of maybe poor hoof trimming, poor feeding, bad flooring, genetics. Tons of things can make animals lame. So that's a really important outcome measure in any animal welfare system. Okay, and then by measuring things, I can tell, are things getting worse or are things getting better? Now, we have a scoring system down in the States called the American Meat Institute Guideline, and if you want to read more about that, you can go to my website, Grandin.com. It's just my last name. And when you measure with this, if more than 1% of the animals fall, you're going to fail an audit for one of the restaurant companies. You're only allowed to have up to 5% of the cattle mooing and bellowing during handling. More than 5% of the cattle, right when you're handling them, bringing them up the chute or in the stun box, bellow or moo, you fail the audit. The plants go, well, that's just impossible. We can't do that. But they're doing it. See, putting hard numbers on it's good because everybody knows what the rules are. We need to use traffic laws sort of as our model. We know what the speed limit is. Police don't just pull people over when they think they're speeding. They measure it. And you hold things to a high standard. I'm a big believer in putting some numbers on things. Handling downer animals is a big issue. One of the best things that USDA did at home was ban the sale of downed cattle to the meat plants. If they're down, come in down, they go in the garbage. Well, look at how skinny these cows are. They were half dead before they ever brought them into the plant. That's just atrocious. Now, in 1996, I collected some baseline data for the U.S. Department of Agriculture. And out of a whole bunch of plants all around the U.S., only 30% of the plants could stun 95% of the cattle on the first shot. And you know what the number one reason why there's such bad stunning? Maintenance of the equipment was horrible. They were not maintaining their equipment. Handling is something that's very, very people dependent. But stunning, especially captive bolt stunning, is very, very dependent on the maintenance of the equipment. And then in 1999, when we started doing the audits, it got up to over 90% of the plants being able to pass. But it requires constant vigilance. If you don't keep measuring and keep auditing, it'd be just like the freeway. Then the handling slowly is going to get bad again. And something in this room is giving me an allergy attack. I don't know what it is, but I've got to make sure I don't sneeze. I keep wanting to sneeze all the time. I want to try to avoid that if possible. But 1999 was a big turning point for improving our slaughter plants, down in the States. I saw more change in that 1 year than I'd seen in my whole life. Because one of the things that used to really drive me crazy, half of all the cattle are handled in equipment that I designed. But maybe only about 20% of the plants that really operate that equipment right. The rest of them went from awful to mediocre, tear stuff up and wreck it. But now when they had customers auditing the handling, they now had, this got things a whole lot better. One of the things that's going to be the wave of the future for auditing farms and slaughterhouses is remote over the internet video auditing, where you got a video camera set up in a meat plant or at a farm, and an auditor in a remote location can look in at any time. Because that solves the problem of behaving good when the auditor's there. Handling is especially susceptible to that. Stunning doesn't change much. Stunning is so dependent on equipment and maintenance. That's much more of an engineering thing. That doesn't change much. But boy, the handling will change. Now, what are some of the welfare issues at a slaughterhouse? People always think high chain speeds. Okay, if a really big plant and it goes really fast, it's terrible. Things are not that simple. There's good big plants and there's bad ones. And there's good small plants and there's bad ones. I can tell you what's bad. Overloaded equipment is really bad. Understaffed equipment's really bad. And some of the worst problems I ever saw with overloaded equipment was a plant that went from 26 cattle an hour up to 35 cattle an hour. And then they started slamming doors on them. That was a mess. You overload, understaff, overwork, yeah, that's going to be a problem. I also get asked, do animals actually know that they're going to get slaughtered? I had to answer that question very early in my career. And I found that they behave the same way at the slaughter plant as they did in the vaccinating chute. You know, how about fear of blood? Well, they can get afraid of secretions from highly stressed animals. That maybe an animal's jammed in a gate for 15 minutes. Yep, his blood, his urine, his saliva, boy, they want to stay away from that. But if you don't have things stay calm, blood's less of a problem than a chain hanging down or a reflection. And the other thing that always happens is you get these videos where they show the back end of the animal kicking. Well, the back end of the animal kicking, that's not what you need to be looking at, because you take the head off, it's still going to kick. You got to look at the eyes. Now, the OIE, you're probably all familiar with the OIE, the World Health Organization now has guidelines on slaughter and transport. And one of the things is you absolutely don't throw drag-conscious animals. It's an absolutely bad thing. One of the big problems we have with a lot of regulations is they're written in a vague way. Like, for example, the USDA has a regulation that says no excessive electric prod use. Well, what is excessive electric prod use? I don't know what that is. You know, but if you put a score on it, like if you can get 95% of the animals through with no electric prod, that's an excellent. And unfortunately, we have to allow the prod on up to 25% of the cattle because Holstein dairy cows, that's the problem area. They have one gear, which is super slow, and but you see, that's still a big improvement over what it was before. Because before you had like a 300 to 400% prod use. Every animal getting it, 4 and 5 times. Now they got to get 75% of those animals through with no electric prod, whatsoever. Okay, I just want to show you what stunning in large plants looks like. This is a piece of equipment I designed called the center track restrainer. Right there, they're using a Jarvis pneumatic stunner. You've got to maintain these tools. You've got to maintain it. Some people say, well, captive bolt stunning's not humane. Well, if you maintain the tool, it will kill them instantly. It has the same effect as a large caliber gun would have. Now, you'll see right there's a little white curtain. And that little white curtain prevents the next animal in line from seeing the gun move down like this. So they don't see the motion. Now, you've got to make sure that white curtain doesn't get ripped off that restrainer. You see, this gets back to paying attention to details. And then right over here, he's using a cartridge-fired gun. And one of the things you got to be very careful with these is cartridge storage. If the shells get damp, they don't work right. It gets down to attention to detail. And this just shows electrical stunning. Pig's in shape. It's got to be placed on it correctly so the electricity goes through the brain. And there's been a lot of controversy right now about stunning chickens. Let's just talk about that just a little bit. These animals are riding through on a conveyor restrainer system. They're in an upright position. Chickens, they got to put them like upside down to get them in the stunner. Stunner works fine. But the problem is the handling. How do we get the chicken into that? Now, I was just up in over in other part of Nova Scotia. Went up and visited a plant that's put in a new gas stunning system. That works really well. Gets rid of a lot of the people management issues with handling. You know, some of you may have seen the videos, the chickens being thrown against the wall and stuff like that. It solves that problem, and you get rid of hanging them upside down. But then you might ask, well, you know, how's a chicken feel when it's going into the gas? Because electric stunning is instantaneous. You put that electric stunner on, it's instantaneously made unconscious. But with a gas stunning system, it's not instantaneous. So how does it feel during that? That can be very variable. And it can vary from some discomfort, which I think is a good trade-off for the better handling, to total panic and terror trying to get out. So you've got to make sure you monitor how the animal is, you know, being induced into the anesthesia. You've got to monitor that all the time. That requires some management. But I think overall, on the whole, for chickens, you know, the gas stunning is going to be the way to go. Okay, high chain speeds. I actually looked at some data that we got from all these audits we've been doing from the restaurant companies on the percentage prodded and the line speed of the different plants. And there really wasn't hardly any difference here. The one that was 51 to 100 happened to be the worst one on the prod use by, you know, strictly by chain speed. The best one was the one that went from 100 to 200 an hour. You know, that's a big plant. We already talked about the problems of understaffing, you know, exceeding the capacity of things. You know, one time I took a person who was very interested in animal welfare to one of our big plants that we have in Colorado. Everything was working absolutely perfectly. And she stood up there next to the restrainer and she says to me, "Is this a big plant?" And I go, "Yeah, it's a big plant. It's one of the biggest in the world." And she just couldn't believe this big plant was so nice. Because everybody just assumes big's automatically bad. What's bad is poorly managed. Poorly managed is bad. Overloaded, understaffed is bad. Does the steer know he's going to get slaughtered? Well, I can tell you, that steer right there is more worried about the guy with the big silver aviator glasses standing up there. Now, one thing good in this picture, there's a backstop gate right here, and they have it chained up. That's good. Another good thing in this picture is you see how you've got some translucent skylights in that tunnel? Some translucent paneling in there to let in light, because they don't like going into the dark. Well, these are the places where very early in my career, in the early 70s, I had to figure out if the cattle knew they were going to get slaughtered. This is the local Swift plant. This picture was taken around 1972, 73. And here's the local feed yard. And these were the two places I actually went to. And I'd go back and forth to these places within the same day. Usually the cattle were calmer here because they had better handling. You see, this fence isn't even that high. You got tiger stripe promise in there. They can jump over that fence. Only once I ever see an animal jump over that fence after, you know, 3 or 4 years of going over there every week. You know, yeah, there's some stress when you handle them, but it's similar in both places. Let's look at some stress figures of cortisol. Okay, up there are your baselines. You know, you've got catheters and you're taking the data when you're sleeping. Okay, beef cattle, 24 to 63 nanograms per milliliter, just blocking them in the head gate and getting blood samples, doing no castration, no dehorning. And then you go look up cortisol, you know, in the plant. It's the same. It's the same, except for this extreme stress. That's where cattle were put on their backs for 103 seconds. But that was in a ritual slaughter plant in Europe. The regular plants and your plants here all handle them in an upright position. So the same range. You know, and you get cattle out on a ranch where they seldom see people when they come into the corrals, they can make some stress. But if you could work on training your cattle, walk out amongst them, make coming into the corrals a good experience, then you can have very low amounts of stress. Here's a basic principle. When an animal voluntarily cooperates with what you do, you have very little fear stress. And most of the stress I'm talking about is fear stress. You force it to do something, you're going to have really, really high fear stress. And voluntarily do it, it's low. I've done a lot of work with zoos on training antelopes to cooperate with having blood tests and other veterinary work done. So while they're eating treats, they get veterinary work done. But they're very specific. One of the antelopes was trained, you could walk up to it in a pen and just stick an IV in the neck. Fine. And you could stand, do an IV, fine. But then the student thought, well, I can just do a shot up here. Well, that didn't work. It was trained. See, this is how specific animal thinking is. IV in the neck's okay. Back here, that's a different picture. I knew a horse that was afraid of black hats because when he was abused, he was looking right at a guy's black hat. White hat was fine. Another horse was scared to death of naked white saddle pads. If a saddle was on top of the pad, it was fine. You see, that's a different picture. They often associate a sound or a visual thing they were looking at right when something really bad happens. Now, let's look at the issue of religious slaughter. You know, the slaughter, kosher slaughter, halal slaughter. You have two issues here. How do you hold your animal and handle it? Which I have to say up here in Canada, you do a much better job than we do down in the States. We have an exemption called the bubble where the federal inspectors don't regulate it. You don't have that here. Up here, you've got some very good regulations on it. You have to hold them in an upright restraint. They've got to go down within a certain length of time. But how you hold and handle your animal and the actual, cutting of the throat itself. Well, we unfortunately still have some plants that do this because of religious exemption. Talk about vocalization score, 100% vocalization score. You can see that steer's tongue is out. Absolutely terrible. I worked with a lot of plants on getting rid of this stuff. Most of the big plants have gotten rid of this, thank goodness. And I can tell you, one of the things that made them get rid of it was safety. Too many employees landing in the hospital. Now, this is OIE Animal Welfare Code, and I was on the slaughter committee. And one of the things I worked very hard for when I was on this committee is I said we need to get some really strong language about really bad stuff that people just shouldn't be doing, like hanging up live animals by their legs, other than chicken. Inappropriate use of stunning equipment, that's using stunning equipment for prodding and stuff like that. Some developing countries, they blind animals, break legs, cut tendons. That kind of stuff, I don't care where you are, you need to just ban it. Dragging, throwing animals, using the punctilio where you just sever the spinal cord and then the head stays alive. That's really awful methods. I mean, you need to just come out and state it. I'm sick and tired of sort of wishy-washy wording where they say adequate space, sufficient this, proper handling. What's proper handling? What's proper procedures? There's certain bad stuff you need to just come out and say, this is bad stuff and we just shouldn't be doing it. Let's get back to kosher slaughter. Here's an animal being held in an upright restraint device. That's required here in Canada. One of the things we did here is we built a box around his head so he doesn't see all the commotion out in the plant. That helped to keep the animal a whole lot calmer. And this is another upright restraint device. Now, in the Jewish religion, they use this long special knife called a halif. And if you're going to do slaughter without stunning, you better be using that long special knife, or the animals do feel it. I watched some veal calves get slaughtered with a rusty old knife from the knife catalog, and that was absolutely terrible. In kosher slaughter, they're required to use a special knife. And in the early 90s, I was hired by a company to take out the shackle hoist system like I showed you earlier. It was my job to tear that out and put in upright restraint devices. So I went down there for startup, and I was operating the box, and I'm going, we really do this right. I don't think the cow feels it. So I put the head holder on so loose the cow could pull his head out, a whole bunch of them, and they didn't. But the problem, slaughter without stunning, is you got to really pay attention to process details, like calm coming in, the knife has to be perfect, the cut has to be done perfect, the restrainer can't be squished on them. It's a ton of detail. Regular slaughter with stunning is much easier to do. You can be a lot sloppier in procedure, and it still can be decent. There's a big difference if you use really good technique on how quickly cattle will collapse. Sheep will go down usually within 10 seconds. They have all their arteries up in the front. Cattle have a few arteries up here in the back. That's why cattle take longer to go down. But there's a big difference between good and bad technique. Now, what about using stunning in religious slaughter? Well, the most orthodox religious slaughter does not allow it, and that's true here in Canada too. You also have some regular kosher where they do allow it after the cut. And halal is often a lot more flexible. They'll often allow stunning, and I want to encourage that because they don't have the special knife. And hacking up cattle with a knife that's too short, that's bad. That's absolutely totally bad, and they struggle violently. And it's not okay animal welfare. We already talked some about, are they afraid of blood? In working this box, I'm like, I couldn't believe it. They'd walk into the box, it's covered with blood. as long as the whole thing was red on the inside. If you had the floor rubbed off and you had part of the floor being silver, well, they wouldn't walk over the silver part. You get a really stressed animal. Like I remember one time I was at one of the plants, and the steer flipped over backwards in the chute, and he hadn't even gotten to the slaughtering part yet. And he was in there about 15 minutes before I could get him out, and he slobbered, and he urinated all over the chute. You could not get other cattle to walk over his fear slobber. There was a fear substance in there. You know, but it takes like 10 or 15 minutes for it to come out. It is documented in the literature. Big problems with captive bolt and things like that. Lack of maintenance, training. We already talked some about that kicking occurs even if an animal's unconscious. People have got to learn the right method for this. What about some of the transport issues? I'll tell you the number one issue, fitness for transport. That's the number one issue. You got to put a fit animal on that trailer. You know, and then there's concerns about death losses being hauled long distances. One of the most important things is fitness to travel. Here are unfit animals for transport. Old coals that are so skinny and weak they can barely walk. Lame animals that can barely walk. Animals that have been fed too many beta-agonist feed additives that make them weak and lame. You know, you just pull the calves off the cows and ship them screaming, bawling calves. Then you wonder why they get sick when they get to destination. And little baby dairy calves, unless you're hauling them just a few miles to a special calf rearing facility, baby dairy calves should not be hauled long distances. You know, and then people have just got to do the sensible things, like, you know, putting the boards in the side of the truck. And what a lot of people don't realize is freezing rain can be absolutely deadly to livestock. It's often more deadly than dry cold, and you have a lot of freezing rain up here. And you all know that if you park your car in the sun, how hot it gets. And you all know you don't want to leave a dog in a hot car just sitting there baking. You don't want to leave animals in a hot truck just stationary. If you can't unload them promptly, then get out and drive the truck around, because that helps to ventilate it. Here's just a little handy-dandy livestock weather safety index. Combinations of high heat and humidity can be especially dangerous. These slides are now on this computer, and if somebody wants to use them in a class, that's just fine. They can get this chart. And what are some of the problems with long-distance transport? The animals that tend to be transported the longest distances are animals like old cold cows, old sows. You know, most of the market animals, feedlot cattle or even grass-fed cattle or market pigs, most of those are fairly short distance. But then, you know, one of the problems you have in North America is where you raise calves, you know, to feed out for beef. That's like in our southeast. And then where you feed them out, it's another part of the country. But the important thing is, boy, you've got to put fit animals on a trailer. Here are some ways that we can improve welfare and handling. Incentive pay for handlers and transporters. The worst way you can pay people to handle animals is piecework. In other words, the more chickens you load per hour or the more pigs you load per hour, the more rough they're going to be. You know, you give workers bonuses for having low levels of broken wings. I introduced that to the poultry industry in the U.S. They thought it was normal to have 5% broken wings. Just by improving handling, we got it down to 1%. And you say, well, okay, if the whole crew can keep it down to 1%, they get an extra $30 a week per person. Get some incentive there. You pay people for not damaging animals. Really can make a difference. You handle cattle rough, you're going to double the bruising. Bruised meat, you got to cut it out and put it in a rendering plant. Can't use it. Another thing I've observed is people want new technology more than they want the management. They'll buy the new drug, they'll buy the new computer, they'll buy the new milking parlor or whatever, and they expect it to be automatic magic fix. You've got to have management to go along with it. And when I first started out, I thought I could fix everything with engineering. If I could just build a perfect system, I could do everything with engineering. I now learned I can only do half of it with engineering. Okay, here's a dairy. It's got fancy transponder on the cow. Yep, and knows, you know, when she milked, what she's eating and everything. But you know what? Somebody's got to look at the computer. It's not automatic management. And one of my big concerns today, and we really need a lot of people to go into, we need a lot of large animal veterinarians, especially pig and cattle veterinarians, both here in Canada and in the U.S. The people that are running the meat inspection agency, the animal health agencies, a lot of those are going to retire. Who's going to replace them? I'm getting very concerned about, where we're going to get good field people to work on solving problems out in the field. Because one of the things I'm seeing, a lot of people today that are interested in animal issues, is they're getting way too abstract. I call it abstractification. We got a lot of people now, if they're interested in animal issues, they want to become lawyers. Well, okay, so they go sue stuff. But they don't look into how that's going to transfer on the ground. What's going to happen on the ground? The attitude of management is one of the single biggest factors that determines how animals are treated, especially when it comes to handling the slaughter plant and transport. And what I want to do now, hopefully you can stick around for a little more time and we can do some good discussion, as I always like to do good discussion. And if nobody has a question, I'm going to pick somebody. So who am I going to pick? Who's going to get their hand up? Okay, I'm going to pick somebody. Okay. Movement towards training people? Yes, yes. Yes, the question was movement on training people with stunning. Yes, there has been. In fact, 10 years ago, the American Meat Institute started their animal handling and care workshop, and we just had a few people attending it. Now we have like 300 or 400 people attending that workshop. A lot of the plants now have, the employees have to be trained. Okay, when in the 80s when they had the big safety push, you could not just anybody could drive a forklift. You had to get training, then get a sticker on your hat saying you were qualified to drive the forklift. Now they're doing a similar thing, like for humane handling, stunner operator handling, and you can't do those jobs unless you have a sticker on your hat that you've been through the training. Some plants are doing a really good job on it. But and what's driving it has been the big customers. See, when the big customers like McDonald's or big supermarket companies, Tesco's in Europe, for example, requires some standards, it can really make a difference. And one of the things that I've been doing, working with a lot of companies, is clear standards. We had a horrible problem with our organic standards. They talk about access to pasture. What's access to pasture mean? Well, now they're getting into something that's going to be a whole lot clearer, like the access to pasture has to be from, first killing frost to, last, end of killing frost to next killing frost, so it'll vary with what part of the, of the country you're in. But you've got to have something that's clearly written so that, people understand it. And one of the things that made the numerical scoring work is it was absolutely clear what the plant had to do. Because I would go out there and when we were training the McDonald's, Wendy's, and Burger King auditors, the plant failed the audit, but it was numerical. That helped with, it wasn't my opinion that they failed. They just didn't make the scores. Now, the trick is on picking out these scores. How do you pick out the things to score? I call them core criteria. And what you got to do is you got to pick out a good core criteria or a good CCP, critical control point. It measures lots of problems. Lots of problems. Like lameness. There's 10 different things that can make a cow lame. It's up to the veterinarians to fix it. But I can go in and audit the dairy and say, yeah, your lameness is really terrible. It's an animal-based outcome measure. I got a lot of vocalization going on at the slaughter plant in the stunning chute. Something bad's going on up there. They're slipping on the floor. They're slamming doors on them. They're prodding them too much. The stunner's broken. It's an outcome of a lot of bad things. So what you want to do is you want to pick out relatively few things that you're going to measure with numbers, and you're going to really hold them to it. And these things are going to count more on the audit than training documents do. Okay?
What are the cost benefits of that welfare system? When you're pushing on an animal suit, that's how you're making money, these big plants. Is it more time consuming to treat the animals better, or are they making more because there's less dart cutters, there's less bruising?
That's a good question. Okay, let's start with pigs. My student Lily's just finishing up a study now that shows very clearly that last 5 minutes in the stunning chute, if you get pigs all, prodded up with electric prods, you're going to make the lactate levels go up, increase PSE. You can wreck pigs in the last 5 minutes. In beef, you cut down on bruises. There's a gigantic safety advantage with beef, too. Not having employees end up in the hospital, that can be a giant advantage. One of the things they had to do to make the handling easier is they had to systematically go through and find all those distractions. Now, the good news is that out of 75 plants, pig, pork, and beef plants, only 3 had to do something really expensive, like rebuild the whole front end. Everybody else, it was simple stuff. Steel gratings, woven tire mats on the scale, steel bars welded to the floor of the stun box, simple stuff. There were some lights purchased. That's simple stuff. There were some lights moved. And there was pieces of metal put up, to block vision. And they experimented with large pieces of cardboard first. These are things that were very inexpensive. Most of the plants didn't have to rebuild a whole lot of stuff. And they actually found out it was easier. And then on some of the beef plants, they found that the downers, went down in terms of having a downed animal. And if you get a downed animal in your chute, that's 15 or 20 minutes worth of downtime. That's a ton of money in a big plant. Okay.
Kind of goes along with that one. How do you feel with the product labeling? Because I know here in Canada it's sort of going through a change with it because the management aspect, like you said, is the biggest issue. And when you had to compete with products outside of Canada or the U.S. that are using management, we basically slave labor for the people. That adds the whole cost to it. So
You mean to compare? I don't quite understand what the question is.
well, have you done much work with product labeling to kind of bring in the welfare aspect?
You mean,
of it?
well, yes. I mean, there's stores like Whole Foods that, they've got welfare standards. They have different levels of welfare standards. Level 1 is the basic welfare, and then goes up different levels. A lot of the niche marketers have welfare standards. Organic right now is rewriting their standards. What I think is going to happen in the industry is there's going to be 2 big segments of the industry. You're going to have like 25% of it be all these different niche markets. And then the other 75% is going to be large-scale commercial. Now, I think there's things that large-scale commercial is going to have to change, like sow stalls, for example, sow gestation stalls. 2/3 of the public don't like sow gestation stalls, and they're not going to buy them. Well, I think the whole industry eventually is going to phase them out. I mean, they're going to be banned in Europe after a certain number of years. One thing on labeling that's really important is whatever you put on your label, you better be actually doing it. You've got to be actually doing it, not saying it. Now, I've been working with some companies right now on verifying their whatever they put on their label from a welfare standpoint, and you got to have a good auditing program, which means you got to have some third-party auditing oversight from an independent auditing company. You got to have field workers going out, visiting every farm at least once a month, and then you got to have some corporate audits too. Slaughter plants, you audit all of them all the time, but if you've got 600 farms or something like that in a program, you can't you can't send a third-party auditor out to every farm. You're going to go broke with airline tickets. But you've got to verify you're actually doing what you're doing. Just having affidavits signed in paper saying, well, I did this, I don't think that's good enough. But basically, right now in the U.S., they've just rewritten what's natural standards, and then rewriting the organic standards because they're not clear. And one of the things that drives me crazy, now, let's say for basic farm animal welfare, I'm going to write down up here things that I consider core criteria. I don't care whether you're organic, whether you're high welfare, I don't care what, or you're regular commercial. I want to study. I want body condition score. I want to make sure I don't have a lot of skinny animals. Lameness better be on there. And then I'm going to do dirty animals. Coat condition. That's especially important if they're not using, our organic program doesn't use lice medicine and stuff like that. I got to measure these things, and then lesions and injuries. And those are going to have to be specified for each species, like swellings on dairy cow legs. And the thing that I've found on these measures here, there's a big, big, big difference between the top 25% of the dairies and the bottom 20% of the dairies on things like leg lesions. It's like 3 times more leg lesions on the bad dairies than on the good dairies. And what separated the good dairies from the bad dairies? Care and maintenance of the stalls. Putting bedding on the stalls and cleaning out the stalls and taking care of them. Okay?
Chronic
Chronic lamenesses in feed yards. I mean, what to do about it? Well, first of all, I want to find out why they're lame. And I'd like to try to correct it so we don't get more of those cattle. You know, if they got hoof rots, if they got, you feed them too many beta agonists, I guarantee you're going to make them lame. You go overboard on that stuff, and it's dose dependent. The more you give them, the more likely you are to have a problem with it. First of all, I'd like to try to figure out what's making them chronically lame. And so when the next batch of cattle comes in, I'd like to prevent the problem. Because as far as I'm concerned, I'm going to just say roughly, you got more than 5% of your animals lame. I don't care what they are. You got a problem, and it needs to be corrected. And this is a major core criteria, and it's a core criteria for pets, too. And a lot of dogs have got a problem with that. It's a skeletal abnormalities. That's big number one for lots and lots and lots of different kinds of animals. Birds, pets, dogs, cattle, sheep, doesn't matter what it is.
More of a way to go towards preconditioned calves and stuff.
Well, we need to be, I mean, the thing is, this is an animal-based outcome measure of a whole bunch of bad practices. And instead of, you guys are the veterinarians. You guys have to figure out how to fix this stuff, but I can measure this. There's 10 or 15 different things that can make them lame. And if I got more than 5% of those animals that are lame, then something needs to be corrected. Whatever the problem is that's causing it. You know, dairy cows, you can feed them too much grain. The stalls can be terrible. They're standing in muck. They don't have any hoof trimming program. There can be some genetic factors. There's a whole lot of things that make them lame. You see, and the trend in animal welfare auditing is to go to animal-based outcome measures. These are very clear things. There's a very nice lameness scoring, zinpro.com/lameness. Now, there's also a difference between scoring these things for veterinary diagnosis and scoring these things for just for an audit. An audit has to be simple. It's like a screening tool. I'm going to classify them as lame and not lame. So on the 5-point Zinpro scale, the 1s and 2s will pass, and 3, 4s, and 5s will be marked up as lame. I'm going to do yes, no. Same thing with body condition. She's either too skinny or she's not too skinny.
Maybe one last question.
Okay.
I have a small animal question. What sort of thoughts do you have on design of kennels in small animal veterinary clinics to reduce stress on dogs and cats?
One of the biggest problems I see in a lot of kennels is a noise. Man, the dogs are barking and all that, and the noise. One of the most important things we can do too for animals in shelters is to take those pets out every day for 45 minutes to an hour of quality time with the person. That cuts down a lot of barking. But I remember one time going in the intensive care ward. Here's this poor sick animal with a zillion bright lights on it, all this noise. How's it going to get any rest? I suggest putting a blanket over the front of the cage, and it was just so bright. How's it going to sleep? Sometimes you need to just think about some of the simple things. The other thing is, how long you keep it in the hospital too. It's going to be they get separation anxiety. I think one of the big problems we got now with pets, like down at home, we've got draconian leash laws, and dogs aren't allowed off the leash except in the dog park or in your own yard. Dogs aren't getting socialized. I think that's made dog bite problems worse, and we got a lot of problems with separation anxiety. And animals are very variable on how they tolerate separation anxiety. Some tolerate it a lot better than others. But there's dogs where, chewed their foot off, they ate the front door. What needs to be done with that dog is leave it at the next door neighbors, its home while you're at work, put it in doggy daycare, or buy another dog so that or adopt another dog from the animal shelter so it has a friend to be with.